So in honor of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, Sunrise Movement San Diego is holding a panel, Our Ancestors Speak Through Us, Share Traditions of Environmental Justice, which is AAPI members to talk about their perspective and lived experience in figuring out their identity and doing activism work, particularly fighting against climate change and pushing for environmental justice. The goal of this panel is to inform and motivate people of all identities to take part in activism in one form or another, especially in the current climate where there is a growing recognition of AAPI discrimination and violence. I also want to acknowledge the Kumeyaay people and their land that we are currently living on today. My name is George and I'm a Vietnamese American. I go by the he, him pronoun, and I will be facilitating this panel. And I'll have everybody introduce themselves, starting with you, Czeska.
Hello, I'm Czeska. I am a Filipino American born and raised on Guam, and I go by she, they pronouns, and I will pass it on to Sanya.
Hi, my name is Sanya. I'm an Indian American born and raised here in California, and I use they, them pronouns. And I'll pass it on to Alex.
Hey, Alex here. I am from a Chinese Vietnamese refugee background, and I use he, him pronouns. And I will pass it over to Hannah.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm Chinese American and I use she, her pronouns. I'll pass it over to Riley.
Hi, I'm Riley, half Indian, and I use they, them pronouns. I'll pass it on to Tenzin.
Hello, my name is Tenzin. I use he, him pronouns, and I identify as Tibetan American. And I think the last one is Meera.
Hi, my name is Meera. I use she, her pronouns. I am Desi American or half Indian American, and my family or my ancestors are from the Punjab region of Northwest India and Northeast Pakistan. And I'll pass it back to Tenzin. No, it wasn't at Tenzin, it was at George.
All right, thank you. And that's basically will be everybody for the panel. And so to begin the discussion, I do want to give some historical context and the evolution of the term Asian American. So before the 1970s, Asian made up about less than 1% of the total population and were majority Chinese, Japanese, and Filipinos. They were known as Orientals, Asiatic, and racial slurs were also used to refer to them. They were basically seen as foreigners in their own country. And it was until 1968 that a professor named Yuji Ichioka, and I believe a student named Emma G, create the Asian American Political Alliance at University of California, Berkeley, which led to the term Asian American we know today. And they noticed that most Asian American students were protesting individually instead of a coalition, and wanted to unite them under one banner to fight for social and political change. So this group, AAPA, identified as anti-imperialistic and fought for self-determination and liberation for Asian Americans, and expressed solidarity for other people of color throughout the US and the world, particularly in colonized countries. And this was also at the height of the Vietnam War, and there was a lot of growing recognition of the common themes of how the US involves itself in foreign policies and how Asians share this common experience. So now Asian American make up about 6.5 of the total population, and it's more diverse, including Indians, Vietnamese, Korean, Pakistan, Thai, Hmong, Cambodian, Laotian, Taiwanese, Bangladesh, Burmese, Nepalese, Indonesian, and Sri Lankans. The immigration reform during the 1940s to 60s saw a rapid increase of this diversity by abolishing national origin quotas and removing prohibition against Asian immigrants. And the term Asian American also included West Asians, including Jewish, Armenians, Iranians, and Arabs, but eventually they branched off to be considered Middle Eastern American in recent years. So I know this is a lot of information, so I feel like you don't have to like absorb everything, but just try to resonate and I guess grow in terms of what I'm like talking about. So in 1978, there was a congressional resolution to designate the first week of May to commemorate Asian American and Pacific Islanders, which eventually became a state-endorsed month in 1992. In the 1980s, the US Census grouped Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders together, and Pacific Islanders include inhabitants in Polynesia, Malaysia, and Micronesia, which makes up many islands and are currently at the forefront of the consequence of climate change, having a very direct impact on their daily lives. And with this, the first topic I want the panel to address is the identity as a Asian American or Pacific Islander, because this all started out as a more of a political term, and it can be as a simplification of multiple group of ethnic people with different cultures and languages. So my first question will be, what is your relationship to the term Asian American or Pacific Islander? So I guess we can start with Hannah.
Yeah, so just to start off with, I feel like the term Asian American, when I'm talking about my school experience, when they say Asian American, they pretty much just mean East Asia. So while the term Asian American can seem like a monolith, like it's lumping every single type of person in the Asian diaspora under one term, I've also found that it leads to almost an oversimplification, like you touched on, George, of what Asian American really is. So I personally feel more comfortable identifying myself as Chinese American. It's more specific to me. It makes it impossible for other people to like confuse me as other breeds of East Asian, if that makes sense. And yeah, so I don't really feel like the term Asian American or AAPI encompasses my identity as a Chinese American. And just overall, it's a little bit de-individualizing in my experience.
Yeah, so we can also continue on with Tenzin.
Yeah, I really appreciate what Hannah said about how in kind of our like understanding of the term Asian American, it usually defaults to East Asian because I also have that similar experience. And at the same time, that kind of reflects on my relationship to the term Asian American as kind of a defense mechanism that I would use growing up, especially in groups of people that and like school, for example, where there were Asian kids, but there were not that many Tibetan kids specifically. So I would have to kind of rely on that shared commonality of being Asian, doing like hanging out in places and eating foods that would be considered like more East Asian, to kind of establish that relationship and find a sense of belonging. But as I've grown up and had more time to kind of be introspective on my own identity, it's helped me become more comfortable with considering myself less as Asian American and more as Tibetan American.
And then Riley, would you like to say something too?
Yeah, I think Tenzin, what really hit me from what you said was like, I feel like it's the worst for kids because like as a kid you have no idea what you are and you're just lumped in to this like huge group that a bunch of other people are in. You may not necessarily identify with like the majority of Asians that are in your area, and then it's like there's this like identity crisis kind of thing where it's like it's so unfair to kids like to not respect the backgrounds of their families like that. I definitely felt that growing up. And yeah, because there weren't that many Indian people in the school that I went to, so or even like Pakistani or just other like Desi Americans. So yeah, I had kind of a similar experience, and yeah, it's just like it's wild that it's that so many different types of people are lumped together.
Yeah, so that's a good point that you made, because we do, like, as growing up, we do want to find acceptance in our community and our lives that we are currently in. So I do want to bring up, like, you guys brought up good points about it is pretty broad given the vast difference in culture and languages, but we also share some similarities in terms of experience and tradition. So I want to ask, how can this like unite us in like a similar goal? So I can start first. So I guess um, when my family came here through as refugees, they lost basically everything, their livelihoods, their everything they own basically. And they want success for themselves in a new country that they barely have any idea about. And they want to have their children like me to be successful as well. And I feel like that's a common theme in a lot of um, Asian people and Pacific Islanders who came here as refugees or immigrants. And I believe like a shared goal, especially this is something that we're going to be touching on a lot, is environmental justice, because we felt it in some way or another. So Czeska, do you have something?
Yeah, I think something that I was exploring yesterday was like experiencing being privileged, but also experiencing being oppressed, right? So like those two things are a challenge that I have to navigate at the same time. And so like I think that's something that we share as well. And I try to, I don't know, someone I was talking to was just like, you're oppressed too. But I was like, okay, I'll put it on a t-shirt. But basically it's like, yes, I understand like Asians are like the closest in proximity to whiteness, but like we are also oppressed. And I think something that I find challenging is that like we buy into that narrative that like we are like Asians are being sold this narrative to be put as a wedge between liberation for Black folks and like the dismantling of white supremacy. And that's like something that I'm trying to just sit with as an Asian person with my parents' experience and goals for me to be successful, right? And like, what does successful mean? And does it mean that I, you know, am successful at the cost of Black lives, you know? So that's something I've been thinking about.
Yeah, so that's going to be a topic that we will explore deeply in this panel in terms of like the modern minority myth and how it divides us with other communities as well. So Alex, do you have something to say?
Yeah, to add on to what Czeska said. So I personally found myself very conflicted and in an awkward position, because when it was May and it was AAPI month, I was just like, how do I talk about this? Because I don't feel like we are quote unquote oppressed, but it's like absolutely true. We are not treated like white folks. And so I was just trying to figure out where is a space where I can talk about it. And I think it's really from my own experience in that I am not treated like a white person. And many of us are not in this way. And I'm definitely struggling with it too.
All right, so I guess Riley, you can bring up something as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's interesting because like there's this simultaneous recognition of if us as Asian people are not are made to not imagine ourselves in solidarity with other communities, then we won't be, right? And that's useful for the oppressor. But also, if that power is given to us, a certain amount of power, you know, not the same amount of privilege, then there is an imbalance of power that has to be recognized. So I think it's critical to, you know, use that power, use your privilege basically, and also imagine yourself in solidarity, because if you don't and you're like, oh, I'm separate, then you're not going to be able to communicate with people on a human level. And like that's what that's what oppressors want. They like no solidarity. Perfect.
All right, Meera, do you want to continue this discussion?
Yeah, Riley, what you said resonated with me a lot. I really like that you brought up the word solidarity as a tool to fight against white supremacy. And it brings me back to kind of the word Asian American, or the phrase Asian American itself. You know, what is Asian American? It's a word, and what are words? They're tools. And is it helping us or is it hurting us? And how can we use that identity to build solidarity with each other, as the original intention was when they coined the term, as George was talking about earlier, in Berkeley, and how can we use it both to like form solidarity with other groups who have faced U.S. imperialism, who have either really abstractly or like really directly been torn from their countries via U.S. imperialism, and how can we have solidarity with other groups that aren't under that umbrella of Asian American. I think it's a useful, while it doesn't like necessarily describe my experience well, especially like as a child, like you were saying earlier, I think the more I learn about it as a tool to build solidarity, the more I'm like, oh, I can get behind that.
So continuing on the next topic, there's like this built-in stereotype that Asian and Pacific Islanders have like strong family values. And while that is the case, I do believe that it is also the case for like everybody in general. But so with that, I do want to touch on the aspect of how our family and how has family and the AAPI perspective influenced our view on the environment. So Czeska, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, I think for me, I'm gonna lean into the Filipinos perspective on the environment, and then also growing up on Guam, which is a modern day colony of the United States. I think I never had the language to speak about like what was happening to me until I went off to college or found groups like this and realized like, oh, colonialism is actually an environmental justice issue. And so like understanding a little bit of like Philippine history and how there have been like Filipino revolutionaries who are like abolished Spanish colonization, who went in hard for their country. Like learning about that, like that's an environmental thing or issue, right? It's like asking for your land back and sovereign rights over the land that you have stewarded for centuries is an environmentalist thing, as opposed to just like save our parks, which is an actual, you know, it's important, but it's from a different perspective, right? So those groups I don't really resonate with. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good point, because I do want to also add to the distinction between the environmental issue between Western and our views as well as AAPI. So when we think of environmental issue in like the American sense, it's more towards fighting climate change or going away from fossil fuel, transitioning away from that. But also with as a Vietnamese American, it's more on the land that we live on. Like an example would be like my mom loves to garden. And it wasn't until recently I read about something in Chicago that a Taiwanese person brought up, that there might be lead into the soil that was like beyond the dangerous amount to like garden. So that's like something that really impacted the Asian community, because they also do like to garden and farm their food as well. So Sanya, would you like to continue?
Yeah, and also building off of that, I have a similar perspective on that, both as someone who likes to garden myself and also as someone who comes from a farming family in India that has been seeing the pretty significant effects of climate change there already. There's been significant, the rainy seasons have gotten much worse and like more destructive of crops, and the dry spells and droughts have gotten much more significant, and that's definitely shaped my perspective on it a lot. Because I feel like without that firsthand experience, I wouldn't have the same recognition of how environmental issues are going to start to affect us more, both in Asia itself and when we come back here, like to the Western Hemisphere. And also because that has also shaped my family's perspective of the issue. And I feel like they wouldn't be as recognizing of it otherwise if they didn't have the firsthand experience that we do. So I think in that sense, like the family values and the connection we have to our extended family that's still back in India, seeing these effects has definitely impacted my view and my family's view of the climate crisis.
Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, I guess one point I want to touch upon is, so the idea with that, when we are producing goods, when we are using goods, when we're growing goods, that uses up land and it uses up resources. And I think for my family, one thing was that my mom's side, my dad's side, we grew up like pretty poor when they were in Vietnam. My mom like sold fish at a fish market. And so everything about living was like surviving. Make the best use out of everything you have. When your items are getting damaged or getting destroyed, you try to repair it, you try to reuse it. And so everything about surviving meant use as little as you can, make it last as long as possible. And it's like so ingrained to the things that I do in my normal life, where I will reuse plastic containers to store food, to store kimchi, to store my rice grains. Everything is about reusing things so that it can last. And when we adopt that mindset, we essentially are consuming less and doing less harm on the environment because we're producing less resources.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So that when you said that, it reminded me of the phrase "recycle, reduce, reuse." When I was growing up in America, and like along the way, I think we as Americans forgot about the term "reduce" because I feel like we're consuming more and more. So, Czeska, do you like to add on?
Yeah, I think hearing that just made me think more about like why it's just so fucked up. Basically that here's Alex's mom all the way in Vietnam selling fish, like practicing like regenerative, like a regenerative lifestyle. Meanwhile, like the US is like bombing countries and like funding wars, which is a main contributor of pollution. And so like, again, it just highlights like how we got here in the first place. It's like the people who are affected by this climate crisis are the people who have literally little to nothing to that like contributed to this in the first place. And they're the ones who are affected the most and first and the hardest. Yeah, so I think it just highlights like how crucial it is that these corporations and the United States and other large countries to be accountable to that, like,
Yeah, so that's a good point when you brought up like war and like all this like imperialism, because I do want to touch on that topic as well. So I'm a first generation. So my mom and dad were refugees from the Vietnam War. And so growing up, I started to like do a self journey about learning about my roots in terms of how I relate to Vietnam. And a lot of the things that went on during the war was that there's a lot of destruction of like the like I guess like the jungles there with all these chemicals attack, particularly Agent Orange and all these like landmines that are being placed in Vietnam that are still there today. Like I read a stat that like I forgot the numbers, but basically it costs like way much more to remove those landmines than placing them. And that has a huge impact on the people living there, because I would read stories about how families would tell their kids not to play in certain areas because there might be like a landmine there, or how there's certain areas that they can't farm or grow crops in because of landmines. And yes, people like, this is serious, because how can you tell a kid like you're gonna get blown up if you go there? And like a lot of these areas are in rural areas too. So if something does happen, it's gonna take a while to transfer them to like a hospital or someone to care for them. So I do want to continue on. So we're here as activists, and a lot of the time you don't really see a lot of AAPI people in terms of activism. So I want to get your thoughts on what do your family or parents think about your activism and organization? So we can start with you, Sanya.
Yeah, so I'd say definitely, especially as a young person and someone whose like parents still have a really big influence over my life, it's definitely they definitely were one of the factors that kind of stopped me from entering activism spaces for a long time, just because of what I feel like is what I've considered like a Desi mentality, but also like a broader, potentially like Asian American mentality, of like don't rock the boat. Um, like they feel like, at least they personally feel like, an obligation to like America and the government for like letting them come here as immigrants and like treating them better than other minorities. Um, that like that obligation extends to, we're here like because they were good to us, like don't go causing any trouble for them. Um, yeah, like Tenzin said, the American dream tax, like, all right, like your silence on these issues is the price you pay for getting to come to America. And to me, that seemed like such a limiting mindset, because I felt like so strongly about these issues my whole life. And it's only until very recently that I've like been able to enter activist spaces by myself and kind of get the chance like to grow and develop as an activist and like speak up about these issues, that they're warming to it slowly. But I feel like they're still very set in the mindset of like, just don't rock the boat, don't like go making any drastic changes, don't go like causing any trouble, just like you can just like be quiet on this issue. And yeah, like they definitely have come a super long way in like changing their mindset on that. And I feel like both modern political issues and the fact that politics has seemed to kind of come into every factor of life as opposed to being something that they were mostly silent on before, and also like the influence of like myself and my sister, both as very like passionate activist type of people, have changed that. But it's definitely a work in progress.
All right, we can continue on with Hannah.
Yeah, so just to preface this, both me and Sanya are very, like, relatively young. Both of us still live at home and our parents have a large amount of influence on our lives. And to some degree, I've had a very similar experience to Sanya in that my parents are very much like, we should sort of lay low and try to just like work our ways up. And for me, because my parents came to America like literally flat broke, and they like worked super hard to get to where they are now, I feel like almost indebted to them to follow in what they want for me in staying silent. And to kind of touch on like the discussion of imperialism we were having earlier, I feel like a lot of this is related to Western imperialism inside of China. Ever since like the very beginning of Western influence in China, there have been rebellions and resistance to imperialism, and all of them have been put down bloodily. Probably more recent as well is student resistance and student protests to the CCP in China. And my parents grew up in that environment. They grew up immersed in that history of the government and other powers crushing resistance to those in power. So I feel like to some extent, they've brought those fears over to America and are sort of pushing those fears onto me on my behalf, just this fear of like retribution. So it's been something that's hard to work around, especially as a young person, but I don't know. It's something that I'm super passionate about, and I know that thankfully, in America at least, I probably won't be facing that sort of backlash to the extent that I would probably face if I still lived in China. So yeah, it's my piece.
And we can continue on with Riley.
Yeah, I really connect to that, what you're saying, Hannah, about like family history, because I like didn't know this until very recently, but my grandfather actually like marched against British imperialism, like, I don't know, I guess it was like 80 years ago, or like 60 years ago, and he never talked about it. Like he passed away 2 weeks ago, and I had never heard that story until it was brought up by my parents at his funeral. And so like there are these ways that my family has resisted imperialism, been activists and stuff that they never really talked about. And first of all, I don't know really why. But then second of all, like it's kind of interesting because when he came to the US, I mean, he always paid attention to politics and stuff like that, but never really talked about it. And I feel like it may have been part of that, like now we're here in like their country kind of thing, which like is not how the US works. Like we are all on indigenous people's land. So like thinking that this is a white people's country and we need to stay silent about things like makes no sense. But it's definitely a mentality, and like I kind of like take heart in the fact that my grandfather was an activist, but I'm also like like why isn't that part of a broader spoken of tradition in my family? Why did I learn about anti-imperialism after college as opposed to like as a part of my upbringing, because like all of my family have struggled against this? So yeah, I'm kind of left with some questions which I feel like I don't quite have an answer to.
So we're gonna continue on with Alex.
Yeah. So one thing that resonated with me was when you were talking, Riley, was the part of this is their country. And so I remember there was a point in time where it was really early into the pandemic, and I was like calling my parents every weekend, just seeing how they were doing. Like we were all scared. It was like we just locked down at that point. And so I asked my dad, like, hey, have you and mom been going out on your normal walks? And then he said, no, we've been like too scared. There was this one story of this one lady getting confronted, and she was asked if she was Chinese. And so like he was really scared of having confrontations and attacks happening to him and my mom. And so they stopped walking. And then I told him like, wow, I get your fear. That's really scary. It's really sad. And it makes me sad that's how you feel. But I respect that. And then my dad said, yeah, that's just what happens when you live in a country that's not yours and one you don't belong to. And my heart like really just broke at that point, that we like struggle so hard to fit in and to do our part, to work, to live and play here. But regardless of all that, my dad still doesn't feel like he belongs in this country. And it's really sad to really get that expressed over a phone call.
Yeah, that's unfortunate that a lot of AAPI like face that experience. Like I said before, they felt like foreigners in their own country from history. So we do want to continue on with Tenzin as well.
Yeah, so hearing everybody talk about this has given me like a lot of like kind of ideas to mess around with, and it's been really great. I think like honestly, as AAPI like Americans, we can all kind of, this is like a conversation we can have like for days. But I think kind of my piece to contribute to this is like I kind of see it as ironic whenever like we have parents that are kind of opposed to activism and like us standing up for causes that we see as needing standing up for. Especially from like my perspective as a Tibetan American. My five family members that say like all Tibetans are born activists for our specific issue of oppression, cultural genocide, and neocolonialism. But then when I try and stand up for other issues that are seen as like external, not related to us, that's kind of delving into like unnecessary like activism or something like that. Like, why are you getting involved in that? And where was I going with this thought? Yeah, I find it ironic, and I really like think it kind of speaks to a couple of things that the scarcity mindset that Alex was talking about much earlier, or a kind of a matter of like survivor's mentality, even like having gone through what they went through. But I don't think there is kind of like an Asian country that exists today that still doesn't have some kind of ongoing struggle or cause that is going on within their geopolitical boundaries that needs to be like addressed and needs to be resolved. So I think that irony of Asian Americans aren't politically active when we have so much to be politically active about is salient. And I also understand the perspective of our family members, though, coming from the backgrounds that they do. But I just think that's something that it has unfortunately fallen on us as a generation to resolve, especially for those of us who are first generation Americans. Family just came from wherever they came from. So yeah.
Yeah, so with that, I do want to touch on the topic of, Czeska, do you have something to add on?
Meera was gonna go and then I could go after.
Okay, that's
and
fine.
then I could help segue.
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, I just Tenzin, I'm really struck by the word irony. I think that was a really good like word, a really good way to describe it. I feel that my family is really passive about social issues. They're generally like really just on the grind to to repeat what everyone said, like, we're here, this is where you, I don't know, they're sort of like taken by this colonial mindset, this like American dream grind mindset where like we need to use our lives to extract as much like capital as we can or whatever it is for them, and then like hunker down and save onto it because we never know when it's all going to be taken away from us. My grandparents fled Lahore, what is now Pakistan, in the partition after the British Empire, after British rule in India ended, and Britain fucked them up and basically stripped them from their ancestral lands, and they had to move west to Shimla and New Delhi, and then eventually the United States. And yeah, irony is a really good word because it's like they went through literal like war, like hell. Like Alex, your family, or George, your family, both of your families are refugees. Like it's extremely political, it's extremely violent, and only through collective action do we fight against that. But it's hard to make that connection when like you're sort of cowering in fear from your like ancestral traumas.
Go ahead, Czeska.
Yeah, so going back to like speaking to my family about this, I have had times where I told my mom, where I'll say like, oh, I went to this protest, and she's like, why would you speak out against your government? And I kind of just have to, she barely knows what I do here, but both my parents don't, but I kind of relate it back to what their experience was in the Philippines, like, like Trump and how the police treat people here. Like they are killing people on the street. They're killing civilians on the street, you know? And so like when there's like a modern, like a almost dictator in power, I try to relate it to like what their experience was like in the homeland in the Philippines. So I told her I went to a protest, and she's like, oh, you know, I went to when I was your age, when Ferdinand Marcos was like the dictator for the past 20 years. And same with Riley, like I never knew that my parents even, you know, like I didn't know that they showed up to that stuff, because to me, like they were always like square people. Yeah, so like relating it back to what their experiences were. And then something that Alex talked about with like, you know, their parents feeling like they have to work hard so that they could feel like they belong. But I want to challenge that, because it's like, I don't have to work hard to feel like I belong in this country. And like Riley said, like, this is stolen land. Like I am a product of like the diaspora of like why my parents couldn't even stay in their country in the first place. So it's like, they owe it to all of us for us to stay here. Like they owe it to us to be here. And I don't need to like work fucking hard for me to feel like I'm safe in this country, but that's the reality of it, right? And like, that's what we have to work towards in solidarity with other groups as well, so that they don't use those oppressor tools on us. Riley, did you want something to say, please?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's wild also for me that like, you know, my grandfather like was an activist in India against the British, but then comes to America and participates in like more insidious ways, forms of oppression, like becoming a landlord and stuff like that, where it's like, this is, you know, not killing people. I mean, well, in a way it is, but like, yeah, so basically facing oppression from kind of like an outside nation, but then participating in oppression once he's here, it's like, it's very strange. It's a strange feeling to have that like dichotomy. Yeah.
And then we can also continue on with Alex.
Yeah, so I wanted to touch upon something Czeska had said earlier about like working so hard to basically make it on the stolen land. And like a lot of that really comes from just fear and the way we fund certain things in society that contributes to fear. There was like an article, I think maybe by Robert Reich, that said we should be moving from social control to social investment. And so social control is like funding armies, funding police, funding surveillance, funding weapons, all of this, funding prisons, all this is used to control people when they are acting out. But when we fund and invest in these communities, then people are not living in fear, because they're living in this abundance of, I have what I need, I can thrive. I don't need to be fearing about what if I get sent to prison? What if I don't have money to pay for food or pay for rent? Because I have that covered when it's invested.
So basically, I want to talk about how the model minority myth came to be. And basically, the image and perspective of AAPI has taken a 180-degree turn in Western view. It went from what was known as the yellow peril in the 19th century to the model minority in 1960, which has been used as a political tool against minorities, including the AAPI community, to pit against other minorities. So the yellow peril has its origins in a negative view towards Chinese and Japanese people, that they were a cultural, economic, and social threat to Western society at the time. And so I won't go too much in this perception, because I do want to focus more on the model minority aspect and how it plagues the current views on AAPI communities. So one of the earliest uses of the term model minority appeared in 1966 to describe Japanese American. And this was over 20 years after the end of World War II and their experience of Japanese American people having their properties taken away from them and being forced to live in internment camps. And the usage points to the success of this group of people due to strong work ethics and family values, as opposed to what was known as the problem minorities, particularly people of color and Hispanics. And eventually this expanded out to other AAPI, and the perception of not quite white became definitely not Black. So there has been many theories in this shift of perspective from the yellow peril to the model minority. And one of them was due to the civil rights movement happening at the time, led by African Americans fighting for equal rights and opposing racial segregation. And since Asian Americans at the time were a small minority, like less than 1% in the US, and was not considered a threat, white America decided to use them against people of color to make the claims to focus on their education and family values while conforming to segregation and institutional racism and discrimination. So basically they want to take the responsibility away from themselves and place it on the people of color community. And at the same time as well, Asian Americans formed their own movement inspired by the civil rights movement, since Asian Americans face similar racism and discrimination as well. But unfortunately, it was not successful and faded away in history due to the eventual welcome image of the model minority after years of negative stereotype from the yellow peril. And with this, Asian Americans were ignored, and the same issues of racism and discrimination were never addressed. And this eventually expanded out to other cultural ethnic groups today known as AAPI. So I do want to continue the discussion of what is the impacts and struggles that you personally experience given the expectation of the model minority. And this can include expectation from parents as well and the path that they want for us.
Yeah, I'll start off. So something that has really struck me like over the past year was I guess STEM, is kind of like a thing that's focused on, I think, a lot in Asian communities, and like getting a career in that. I got a career as an engineer, but I think that like a lot of engineering roles actually end up either directly or indirectly contributing to like either the military industrial complex or like surveillance through tech companies, like all this kind of stuff, which actually ends up being pretty bad, not only for us directly, but also our families in other countries. And so I had gotten a job in that in like a satellite industry, which does a lot of surveillance and stuff like that. And kind of like realized pretty quickly after I got the job, like, oh, I had this expectation for myself that, I got from my community for a really long time, not just from my parents, but from like my friends, my peers, etc., who we, as kids, this is all we hear. So we talk to each other about it and like reinforce that idea in our heads. And so, yeah, I was like, had expected this to be my life for so long, got the job, and then I was like, wait, shit, like this, what I'm doing is like actually just actively bad for most people in the world. And I was like, I need to leave this job. So fortunately, I've got a new job now, but like the other side of it was like being able to support myself under capitalism. And like, once you're educated into this job, it's hard to go to do something else that you just want to do. And so it's like a little bit of a trap where you're a child and you're educated in this certain way, and then you're an adult and you're like, wow, I don't really fuck with what I'm doing. Or I don't know if we can curse, sorry, but I don't really vibe with what I'm doing. So yeah, I think that has definitely had a heavy effect on me. And I would say like to any, young Asian kids, Desi kids, like, hey, if you're struggling kind of with what your parents are saying, like it's definitely worth thinking about. Because there's a lot of cultural stuff surrounding that, talk to someone about it, talk to like talk to your auntie who, has different views or whatever, and just kind of get an understanding of the situation. Because I don't think I really did, and I'm learning my lesson now still.
Right, and then we can continue on with Alex.
Actually, I think Tenzin was before me.
Oh, go for it, Tenzin.
Yeah, if your point is on the same note, you should probably go, Alex, but if not, I can continue. My like kind of piece is a little bit of a tangent from what Riley was saying, but kind of in the same note of how all encompassing like these institutions are to like keep these ideas in place, and how hard it is for us to like not get trapped by them. So like the model minority myth, for example, it really brings me back to kind of how I grew up. I primarily grew up in this Northern California Bay Area, and both the San Francisco and the Oakland Chinatowns, just the way that the neighborhoods were built and districted. They're primarily surrounded by other BIPOC communities, and also like primarily low-income communities. So when you put all the people of color together, and when you understand kind of the systems of race and poverty and violence and how those intertwine, it really just provides leeway for like Asians from the generations before us to like actually buy into the idea that these people are in their situations of their own accord, of their own choice, and that's really harmful, because then they kind of provide that mentality down to the next generation, to our generation. And so then you have like, then you have me growing up with like family members that think like these like African American people are like poor for a reason, for they could stop being poor, or like Obama, like he got elected, so racism must be over, right? And these are really harmful like mentalities to kind of pass down to the next generation. And it's again, it's on us to kind of fight them and really like go outside of our scope to assess these issues and these communities, and really see like what's behind it all, kind of pull back the curtain and realize like we're all in different sides of the same struggle.
All right, I can jump in to add on to what Riley and Tenzin were saying. And yeah, so going on the point of pulling back the curtain, I think there is a huge illusion with like going into STEM and defining that as like success in life. Because I know in my family, and this may be in other families, but like I know moms like to one up each other and like, hey, my son goes to Harvard, he is a doctor, he makes 6 figures, and what does your son do? And it's like this battle of one upping each other. And I think that is like something that is ingrained into me. That's how I define success. I need to make a shit ton of money, I need to find a really good job, buy my mom the biggest house, and then that way I'm a successful son, because she will be happy with me, I will be comfortable, and she can also one up all the other moms and aunts she knows. But that is like the illusion. That is the absolute illusion of what comfort means, because it's only comfortable for us because we don't see how it affects other people. Because if we're designing weapons and making lots of monies for the military, okay, great, we're comfortable, but we're also fucking up people in other countries. So we're destroying the environment in other countries, and we don't realize that. It's not connected in a way where we can see cause and consequences in the work that we do. And so I think it was really difficult for me to come to terms. Well, I guess not. It was difficult, and it was a journey for me to come to terms with that. After also being an engineer in electrical engineering, after doing it for 2 years, like I finally realized, wow, this is only really helping out people who can afford it, and everyone else who can't afford it, can't afford these services, these products, they're just left behind. No one is really caring about them. Engineering is not going to care for them. And so that's where I started to shift around into activism. And that's how I'm here now.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And we can continue on with Sanya.
Yeah, so I faced kind of a similar struggle with STEM. Um, like obviously I'm still young, like I'm still in high school, not like in college or working yet, and it's been I've had like a very recent struggle of trying to figure out what I want to do in life and how much of that can be attributed to stuff I'm actually interested in and stuff that speaks to me and like my own passions and the things that my parents always expected me to be and that like the community expected me to be, even if they didn't explicitly pressure me into like pursuing a STEM career. Like the expectation was always there that I was going to do STEM, I was going to be successful, aka like make a lot of money, have like a stable income like my whole life. I don't know, make six figures. As opposed to the only alternative being a starving artist, like in their minds, like there wasn't really much else you could do besides STEM. And yeah, I feel like a lot of that came not only like internal pressures from my family, but also like external pressures, like Riley was saying, like, or yeah, and like how many people before me were saying that there's like the pressure within the community of like parents or like moms trying to one up each other with their kids and like how successful they are. And like it still seems to be like I'm starting the college application process soon. And it's always in the back of my mind of like, even if I love this place, even if I love the fit, is it going to sound good enough when my mom tells other people I'm going there? Like, is this going to look good for our family? And like that pressure is always there. And that pressure is also what stopped me from pursuing like environmental activism or like environmental policy or studying something like that in college. I feel like has also been limited by things like that. Like, is it going to look good? Is it going to look good for my family? Like that, like AAPI value of like family pride and like making your family proud by being successful and like that success being defined like purely by money and being in a STEM career has definitely shaped a lot of both like my life path and also like my activism.
And we can continue with Hannah as well.
So I'm again largely in the same boat as Sanya. I feel like it's a little bit elitist almost to be like, yeah, I want to go to an Ivy League because it's an Ivy League, or I'm applying to Harvard, so I can say I'm going to Harvard instead of thinking about like whether it's a good suit for me. But again, like feeding back into family history almost, it's a form of repayment for me to be successful in the more like traditional sort of sense. Like my parents came here so I could be financially well off in my own future, and they came here so I could have better opportunities. But I feel like the model minority myth has conformed me into that sort of mindset of you can only be successful and you can only make money if you go into STEM. Making money is the only thing that defines your success and like your identity as a person. So yeah, it's something else I've been like trying to dismantle in my daily life is thinking about things in terms of like what they can bring to me. So again, it's something that Sanya talked about, but always thinking about like whether I'm doing this so I can make my parents proud or whether I'm doing it because I genuinely enjoy it. And that's something that's affected me a lot throughout my political organizing. My parents aren't very approving of it. And I knew that like if I wanted to make my parents happy, I would sit down, get straight A's and probably like, I have no idea, get an internship in like biology or something, become a doctor. But again, like something that's fulfilling for me is pursuing activism, even if it like runs a little bit counter to my parents' values, personal values. So yeah, this is very unrelated, but I grew up telling myself that I wanted to be a doctor because my dad was a doctor and my grandparents were a doctor. So I saw that as like my only viable path in life. Again, it's something I've been like trying to dismantle, this idea of like I have to do what my parents did or else I'm like a disgrace, which is very harshly put, but it's something I'm working towards. It's a process of unlearning for me. Yeah.
And we can continue on with Czeska as well.
Every time I try to use a hotkey, it never works. Yeah, so with what I want to talk about with the model minority myth is something that Riley shared with me. It was a Times article called, I wrote it down, We Are Not Silent, and it talks about confronting the US's legacy of anti-Asian violence. And it was written by Katie Lang. And so basically it talked about like, and this is all part of the myth, right? Is that like when in March, when the 6 Asian American women were shot, right? Joe Biden in the same like month or something was like set out to deport like 32 or 38 Vietnamese refugees who had never even set foot in Vietnam. So this fool was like up in the Capitol, like talking about stopping anti-Asian hate, but then like talking, you know, like going back to the article that I brought up that Riley sent me was like, and that Riley's grandfather sent them, was that, you know, like this is systemic. Like, yes, there's like violence from like people that we passed by that was heightened during the pandemic because of Trump's anti-Asian rhetoric. But at the same time, like this country has had policies that are continue to be violent against Asian bodies, right? And Pacifica bodies as well, right? And so like when people immigrate here, like which neighborhoods are we immigrating to, right? We're immigrating to like predominantly Black and Brown communities, right? And so I don't know, I think Joe Biden with his bill to, I wrote it down also, to address this violence against Asian Americans is such bullshit, because if you look at it, it's to bolster law enforcement on crimes or responses and attacks towards Asian American or Pacific Islander people. And we don't need more law enforcement. We don't need more police. And again, it's like me questioning, like, are we gaining this proximity to whiteness at the cost and expense of other Black and Brown folks? And that, like Riley said, like we shouldn't be using these oppressor tools. And I'm so glad that we have this space to speak about it, so that we can be loud about it and just unpack a bunch of the things that we want to unpack. And for myself, like I know, like I need to do better in speaking to my own family members about it, because like they've bought into capitalism, they bought into white supremacy, and it's, to me, it's my duty for everyone else to come to help dismantle that, because the U.S. is in late stage capitalism, and she about to crumble. And so like we're gonna build it up the way that we want to build it up, and we're gonna say, we told you so. Like, we told you so. Todd Gloria, defund the police. And then Riley, if you want to go next.
Yeah, something that you said that really connected with me, and part of the article that really connected with me was they talk a little bit about the history of government oppression of Asian communities in the US. And it like kind of shook me, because I was like, damn, really what comes around for minorities goes around, right? So like deportation camps started with Native Americans and pushing them off their land. And then you have the Exclusion Act of the 1800s, where it was applied to Asians. Now they have travel bans for Middle Eastern countries that Trump instituted. So like the same rhetoric is just really moved from minority to minority, however is convenient at that time. So if we don't fight to weaken and destroy that now, like it's gonna come around to us in the future.
Right. So I do want to continue the discussion of, so we kind of touched on this a little bit, but a lot of us are in the process of overcoming this model minority myth, and we are pursuing the path of activism. So I do want to ask, how did we come to this realization? So for me, I do want to add that I'm also an engineer, and I'm like sitting at the table doing my work and all that. And specifically, I was doing like automation, and like I was always political active, but this made me more passionate of pursuing this more when I was like working my day job. So basically, when I came to a realization that with this automation, it benefit the people who can actually afford it while pushing the people who do these like labor jobs like away because they won't be needed anymore. And I feel like how will these people survive? Because like in the future, I can imagine it being more towards automation to make human life more convenient. And I'm always for that. But at the same time, people's livelihoods will be stripped away from them, especially the poor people, because they don't have the money to invest in these like automation.
Okay, so with regards to how I overcame the model minority myth, I think a big part of it was education and learning that there's like a world beyond just me and my family unit. I grew up in like a fairly affluent community, and a lot of people around me were also Asian American and also were struggling with the model minority myth. But for me, this is really bad advice, but I was exposed to social media from like a super young age, and it sort of got me out of my personal bubble and like my personal knowledge of the world. So from a super young age, I was exposed to like friends that were LGBTQ, friends that were different races, friends that were from different socioeconomic statuses. So through that, I think I ended up fostering a better understanding of the world around me and sort of like fostering a desire to make change in order to make sure that all of my friends could be treated equally as well. So education and empathy was my biggest thing.
And we can continue on with Tenzin.
Yeah, I'm kind of continuing on Hannah's point of education, but specifically education in terms of like kind of understanding like again the systems and institutions that kind of oppress us and all the different communities that live in America, which I really primarily like credit like my college courses to, like the ones I was able to take kind of outside of my major, like on topics that would generally be regarded as not useful to the stereotypical Asian family, like anthropology, sociology, those types of things. And those classes, which I was very, very privileged to be able to take. Anyone who's able to like get a college education and kind of like come to this understanding or learn about these topics is very privileged. But being able to discuss them in a class setting and kind of talk about how the way in which historical like colonialism and subjugation of different peoples and different environments has kind of put us all here in the way in which we live today, really kind of helped make me question like what kind of path I'm on or what kind of path my family wants me to pursue, and even if their intentions are the most pure and positive and always only wanting the best for me as their child, is that kind of what I want for myself, and that's really kind of a daily kind of thought process that I reckon with, and I don't know if you ever really kind of like finish kind of reckoning with that thought process of how you live and what you've learned is how you live in accordance with what you've learned. But it is one that like I'm really thankful to be able to have in the first place, I guess.
And we can continue on with Alex.
Yeah, I think something that was important to me was being willing to grow and learn, because something with me growing up was that there was a lot of shame for me being Asian. And this was something that I had internalized, like just growing up. I remember I was probably like 4 years old. I went to my first day at preschool, and then everyone spoke English, and I was like the only one who did not really speak English fluently. So when I came back home, like it was the evening, I was brushing my teeth, and I heard my parents just speaking in Chinese. And then I like yelled at them, and I was like, "Hey, speak English! This is the U.S." And I was just like, it just like instinctively came out of my mouth. And I think there was just the shame I had that like I speaking the language is not welcome here. We're American now, so we only speak English. And I think growing up, I had gotten like bullied at one point. I was like made fun of for speaking Chinese, and there was just not many Asian people in my neighborhood growing up. It was primarily like affluent and also mostly white folks. And so I like completely disavowed like being Asian. I was completely shameful of being Asian. And when there were other Asians, I would try not to associate myself with being Asian and try not to associate the culture with that, because I was like really adamant, I'm American. And it wasn't until way later, probably college and afterwards, where I started to flip the switch and I started to get like angry. And when I got angry, I started to realize this made me feel empowered. And this is where I started to own it. I started to just own being Asian, because I realized like I deserve to be here. I completely deserve to exist here in the space. And if you don't like it, then okay, you don't like it, but I am fucking Asian and I'm proud of it and I am me. And that's the step I had to overcome. I had to completely brush away the shame, slash it up, and just get rid of it. Like, I am proud. I'm proud of who I am. I'm proud of my identity. I'm proud of my family. I'm proud to be here.
And we can continue on with Czeska.
Yes. So I don't know if I like know how to overcome the model minority myth, but I know like there's ways to dispel it, right? So in to me, I try to lean into groups that I have to deal with like identity. Before I used to think like the groups that have to deal with identity were for people who didn't know their identity and like their culture, which is, you know, such a stupid thing for me to think, and such a privileged thing for me to think too. And so yeah, so I lean into organizations like the Asian Solidarity Collective, who works right now on dismantling anti-Blackness in the Asian community, and also works with like abolitionist groups, right, that are also Black-led. And then another group that I found recently is the Masakata Collective. I am wearing their t-shirts today. And one of the things that they focus on too is like solidarity with oceanic peoples who are dealing with US imperialization. And so what I love about like groups like these is like they understand that. I think it was Fannie Lou Hamer who said like, unless Black folks are free, we are all free. And it's just like understanding that like my liberation is tied to yours and to other oppressed peoples, right? So that's one way that I help dispel it, other than like obviously just learning about it in education. But I do want to bring up, maybe after Tenzin goes, but how to navigate like your identity with like belonging to one culture, but also being a foreigner to another culture, like for our biracial folks over here. But Tenzin, you could go first.
Sorry to cut you off, Czeska, but I really just, like what Alex said really got me going on this one topic, kind of, especially when he was talking about like wanting to feel American and be American. And I think part of that is kind of like with the faces that we see around us, like Alex was talking about, and even like the faces that we see in like the mainstream media, for example. So it's always like the hero who's saving the day always has like, is a white person, you know, whether it's a white guy or now more often a white girl, but they're still white, you know. It's like Spider-Man saving the day and he's the white guy, and the Asian friend is kind of in the back, not really helping that much, but being supportive from a distance, you know, that kind of thing. And then that kind of bleeds into like even the environmental groups that we see, like the most prominent ones in the United States are like predominantly white. You know, when you think of environmental groups in the US, you think of like Sierra Club, like those types of things, which are all predominantly white. So like having a lack of those faces and that representation kind of might feel alienating to some Asians in AAPI who want to get more involved but don't see many of their faces in these groups.
Yeah, and building off of what both Czeska and Tenzin were kind of talking about, like I didn't see anybody in my community participating as activists. So I was really introduced to activism by my Black comrades, specifically my friend Nathan Poland in high school. We were like sitting around a fire and he was like, "I'm an abolitionist. Are you?" And I was like, what does that mean?" And he was like, "I don't think prisons should exist." And I was like, "What do you mean? Like, obviously we need prisons." And then he went into it and I was like, "Wait a second, wait. Prisons don't make any sense. What the fuck are we doing here?" And then like, that was kind of like an abstract conversation, but then I started reading into it and I was like, not only do they not make any sense, but they actively like destroy all minority communities. We're all affected by this. And then going on from just that connection, listening to Black thinkers, whether they be activists, professors, just people making podcasts, sometimes all three. I want to shout out to Kimberly Crenshaw, who has a really good podcast called Intersectionality Matters that has taught me a lot about like everything I believe now. I think like Black thinkers have been considering the problems of American society very thoroughly, and we have a lot to learn from them. So that's also been a big part of what has furthered me in activism, just like listening, sitting at the feet or just sitting around the fire and just being like, I'll take this wisdom and try to live by it.
And Czeska, do you want to continue your thought with solidarity?
Oh, I just wanted to make space for like how, and speaking about the mono minority myth, it's like for folks who identify as like, or who have like a biracial experience, what is that? How does that influence like how you move about in this world?
Yeah, well, yeah, been doing a lot of thinking about that. Grew up really white passing. I've talked to like my cousins who are half like Indian, half Jewish, like just yeah, the being racialized in the United States is really complex. And I think there's a big difference between being racialized in the United States and by the United States and your connection with your ancestors. Both are kind of related to like where you came from. But the way that I understand white supremacy to work is in my life or in my experience as being a multiracial person, being white and Desi, is the whiteness comes in and it tries to squash everything related to my ancestors' culture. It tries to capitalize on yoga and like make it this very white thing. It tries to like erase my Desiness and my experience as a Desi person in the United States by like fully claiming me as like, no, like you're white, you live like this white experience, which, in like many ways I do, but I've had a perspective shift on like not being an ally to like white supremacy erasing my ancestry in my own life by being like, oh, that's what this like poison is in my mind that's trying to like make me like bashful or shy to like claim my Desi identity. It's white supremacy that's trying to squash that. But yeah, it's complicated. Like it's a complicated situation to navigate. Like I don't have my ancestors' language. I don't speak Punjabi or Hindi. Like that's something in the chat people are talking about. Like, oh, damn, I wish I had this like cultural clout of like knowing my language, but it's like inverted from the experience you have as a child, like facing the full brunt of white supremacy, where you're like, I just want to conform. But once you get older and you're like, oh, this is actually really valuable, like on a spiritual level, even, yeah, it kind of inverts.
Yeah, I think to the point of like language, a pretty interesting thing for me growing up was I'm half Indian, half white, but some of the schools that I went to as a kid, and then just like how people view me, they often think that I'm Latinx. And so I'll have like abuelas coming up to me asking for directions in Spanish. And like I've learned enough Spanish in school that I can like kind of give them directions, and maybe they don't notice, they probably do. But the other part of that is that like a lot of credit to my Aji, which is my grandmother. She was like, don't learn Hindi, don't learn Marathi, learn Spanish, because you're taught English, whatever, but as far as the people you're going to be speaking to in this country, like Spanish is the language to learn. So like at the time when she said that, I was like, oh, I need to learn Marathi, because like that way I can connect with this heritage that I no longer have. Ooh, getting emotional. But she was like, build a new heritage, connect with the communities that are here. And that's pretty tough. Like, and I think that that's something that kind of we all have to do. I know we were all talking about in the chat, kind of building a new identity. A lot of us are now here. Like our parents may have grown up somewhere and then moved here, and they kind of hold both of those things. But for us, we have to just hold what we have here. And a big part of that is just connecting with who is here, and connecting, not and like in solidarity, but also emotionally and linguistically, with other communities here. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I feel like that's what important, because we do have to recognize that we are Asian and we are American at the same time, and that's kind of like sometimes they clash with each other, and that's something we have to reconcile and figure out on our journey in life. So we also want to recognize the word. Also want to have the word recognize that we do exist, as did the countless other AAPI throughout history, in U.S. history especially, and even in the present, who were or are not being recognized through mainstream media. And this has made learning about our imprint as AAPI in U.S. history difficult through the AAPI perspective, although our communities have been facing social and environmental injustice. And we do want to motivate youth and our peers through oral dialect, since much of AAPI history and experience in the US has been passed down orally and can be easily lost, as we have been talking about with relation to our family. And so we do want youth to speak up, and as it can be a powerful tool to feel empowered and push for a positive word that they want to see, as they will be facing harsher consequence of climate change. So I do want to end with, what advice would you give to your younger self about navigating their identity and taking action for the AAPI community or the war in general? Because I do feel like a lot of people are facing similar obstacles and don't know how to get around it. So we can start with Tenzin.
I think it's a good segue to the really powerful words that Riley shared, and the topic of like, we are here. And I think if I could talk to my younger self, or anyone out there who is from the, I guess, the younger generation, like, learn where you are, like where you are, like the area around you, and then from there, like where you come from, even if you're able to, and you kind of have to like take that step yourself and go out of the way, because your school is not going to teach that to you. If you're AAPI, you're not going to learn about Western imperialism in China. you're not going to learn about the British colonization. Well, maybe a little bit, but not in the way that you need to learn it. So learning that on your own is really important. And then kind of on top of that, we have this AAPI for a reason. We're Asian and American, and so learning about I'm especially like telling this to my younger self because I wish I had done this more growing up, like learning where you live and like who the people around you are, who are the community members in your area that are suffering, and who are the rule makers and lawmakers, and whose land you're on, really, like what is the history of the land you're on, and who has the power to like impact the decisions in your community, and why aren't they doing that? So that's something I wish I could tell my younger self, and then like just wish that they would be able to like take that extra step to like learn first, educate yourself, and then from there like really see gain a better perspective on what you can do to make a difference as an individual, and then from there find a collective like Sunrise to make a bigger difference in.
Yeah, so I feel like as a person, we always want the answer to everything, like a concrete, definite answer of this is how the world works, as in black and white, yes or no. But my advice would be sometimes, or most of the time actually, that will not be the case. Like even us, we are still on our journey and figuring out things. So even though you're confused or don't know where to go from there, I guess like take it one step at a time. Like Tenzin say, maybe join Sunrise or find a community of people who share your same viewpoints and maybe have a discussion of how things are and how things can be. So that would be my advice. So Czeska, do you want to add on?
Yeah, I think for me, so just a little background, like growing up on Guam, like we were predominantly brown peoples, but then like we operated under systems that the US made for us. So I had the privilege of like still being able to be ingrained in my culture, I guess. But I had like the Catholic Church and all that stuff, kind of just like telling me what to think and like indoctrinating me. So I think for what I would tell my younger self is just to ask more questions. I think I could have had like self-realization moments like long time ago, and I wish I had that. Like I wish I just asked more questions on like why things are the way they are. Like I shared like, why do we eat spam a lot? Like, why do we have spam in our meals? Like, why don't we eat like stuff that they eat in the TV, you know? Yeah, like why did they kick out a girl in high school for getting pregnant? Why, you know? Just that. So just ask questions and don't settle until like it sits with you. And I'm gonna pass it on to Hannah.
Yeah, so my main advice to my younger self would be kind of drawing on the wisdom of my elders. So my family is all based in China, which means I don't really get a lot of opportunities to talk to them. But when I'm around them, I definitely feel like I should have listened more to their stories. As a young kid, I generally like brushed them off whenever they tried to share. And I was like, yeah, I don't know why that matters because we're in America now, which is like not very cute of me. But I definitely feel like recognizing my past and my family's past would have been important in not only gaining a better understanding of like the culture and the heritage that I came from, but also learning like what I'm going to base my activism off of. Because not going to lie, when I was looking over like the panel questions, I was really lost. Like I had to sit down and think for a good long while about how my identity as an Asian American shaped how I view activism. And I feel like a better connection with my ancestral culture definitely would have helped in that regard.
Yeah, I really resonated with what you said, Hannah, because I feel like what we do in our grind in our day-to-day life, it's very much focused on the present. and we don't really acknowledge the past, what happened, how things shaped us, how we became the way we are, how our parents became the way they are, because they've gone through shit too. They've gone through trauma. And when we get to learn their stories and understand them, I think that reconnects us back. That reconnects us back to, yes, like our lineage, but also integrates our past to our present self, if that makes sense. Because I think that's like something that we lose sight of when we're doing things. We don't think about the past. And when we do that, we could totally own what it means to be, you know, our past as an Asian AAPI lineage, and also what our present is being an American living in this country.
Yeah, I second kind of what everyone's already said, but especially with what Czeska brought up and asking questions. There are just a lot of terrible things kind of cooked into suburban life. I lived a much different experience, an upbringing experience than Czeska. I grew up in like a very white suburb, but I was always like confused about a lot of, I don't know, different things between what my life was like, what my grandparents' lives were like, why my mom chose to raise us where we lived. And I don't, yeah, I just don't think I like knew to ask the questions, or knew really the questions to ask. I'm grateful I'm getting better at asking questions, and that I get to be in a community of people who are great question askers. But the big thing I would tell my younger self is, when you feel like something is wrong in your gut, you're right, it's wrong, and you should speak up about it. Or when you feel anything in your gut, like about yourself, like really listen to that, and that's it.
Yeah,
Wait,
and
I want to just second what Czeska wrote in the chat. She says, "Your guts, your ancestors." She's right.
yeah, and I definitely agree with that, and that kind of ties into what I would tell my younger self, which is to maybe embrace my heritage a little more and stop spending my whole life trying to run away from stereotypes only to run back into them. Because I feel like what was such a defining part of my childhood and like my life path that like led me up to like entering activism like later than I would have otherwise was I was trying so hard to fit into the pressures of like tradition and like my family of like staying quiet about things that like I cared about, and I didn't fully understand why I was supposed to do that. And at the same time, I was trying so hard to not be Indian that it kind of like I had like such a conflict like within me that it was hard to focus on developing any other part of myself, because I had such an intrinsic conflict of like what is a really key part of my identity is being Asian American, and I was trying so hard to fight that it limited me from doing anything worthwhile with my time. So I think I would tell my younger self to stop being so afraid of that, just embrace who I am, and that I can embrace the heritage of my culture without being a model minority, that like I can embrace my culture's like traditions and my family's traditions of like historical activism and stuff without that making me a stereotype. Like that, even if I fall into some things like that, it's because that's who I am and not because that's what other people are trying to make me.
Connecting, this is gonna connect back to what you said, Sonia. But I'd say what I would tell my younger self is to start with the present and work backwards to the past. Something that happened in my senior year of high school was the Baltimore riots. And I don't know if y'all really remember that. I grew up in Maryland, so it was a big thing in my community. And at the time, you know, I just listened to news coverage of it, and it was like, oh, you know, a bunch of people are rioting because they killed a black man, and the rioters are like looting and all this stuff. And you know, I took that at face value and didn't really think about the past at all. But when you look back into the history, like there was another set of riots in 1968, and that led to a bunch of civil rights reform. Like the reforms were passed like pretty soon after that. And a lot of those civil rights reforms have really benefited our Asian American communities as kind of like a side thing, or not even a side thing. Like that's direct, that is what solidarity is. So so that's kind of on a community level. Like I feel like I would have been educated much faster about a lot of these issues if I had done that. And then on a personal level, and this is kind of where it connects to what you're saying, Sanya, like if I start with myself and think about my activism, my queerness, etc., and then go ask my family or go think about the stories that they have told me in that context, then I can feel much more validated in my identity. Even if I don't receive direct support from other people in my family or my community, I can see myself throughout my ancestors. And that's really powerful. That's really validating. And I feel like that really helps me kind of move forward. And yeah, I feel like if my younger self had known that, that would be beautiful. So yeah.
Yeah, so that concludes our panel. Our ancestors speaks through us, share traditions of environmental justice. And I would like to thank our panelists and the members working behind the scenes to make this panel and the social media campaign for AAPI Heritage Month possible. And I would also like to thank our viewers for joining us on this panel. So the objective of this panel was to educate, inform, and motivate people about a topic that they might not always be on their conscious mind. And I know our panelists, including me, did a lot of reflection when it came to this topic. So Sunrise Movement San Diego is also on the lookout for members. And if you are interested in getting involved, we do have a link in the video description.